Have you ever found yourself suddenly becoming more productive when a deadline is getting close? Yet before that, even getting started felt difficult. A task you'd been putting off for days suddenly feels easier to do. The same person who couldn't get started can suddenly work for hours. The same person who couldn't focus suddenly knows exactly what needs to be done. And here's the strange part. A deadline doesn't make you smarter. It doesn't give you new abilities either. So why are the results so different? Because those abilities were already there all along. Now here's the question. If you're capable of being that productive, why can't you be like that from the start? Why does that ability only show up when a deadline is approaching? Why not when you first receive the task? Because if this were just about laziness, you should stay lazy all the way to the end. But that's not what happens, which means there's something we've been missing. Because if that ability was there from the beginning, why does your brain only access it when a deadline shows up? And if a deadline can push your brain into a productive mode, how do you get into that mode without waiting for a deadline? To understand why a deadline can change the way you work, we need to look at what actually changes when a deadline starts getting closer. Because most people think the answer is simple. They think productivity comes from pressure, because they're forced to act, because they're running out of time. The problem is, that explanation doesn't really explain what's happening. If pressure were the answer, everyone under pressure should instantly become productive. But that's not what happens. Some people become focused when a deadline is close. Some panic instead. Some keep procrastinating until the very last minute, and others avoid it completely. So clearly there's something deeper than just pressure. What's interesting, a deadline doesn't make you more disciplined, and it doesn't give you extra energy. If you struggle to focus a week before the deadline, your brain doesn't suddenly evolve 7 days later. If the task felt boring a week earlier, the task itself doesn't change. The task is the same. Your ability is the same. Your brain is the same. But the result can be very different. Meaning, what's changing isn't your ability. What's changing is the way your brain sees the task. And this is the part most people don't realize. The human brain doesn't treat all tasks with the same priority. It doesn't ask, is this important for my future? It more often asks, is this important right now? That's why so many things that actually matter often lose to things that feel more interesting in the moment. Studying loses to scrolling. Working out loses to lying in bed. And the most important things often lose to the easiest ones. It's not because you don't care. It's because your brain treats both options differently. As long as the deadline still feels far away, the task looks like a future problem. And the human brain is notoriously bad at treating future problems as today's priority. But when the deadline starts getting closer, something begins to change. The question is, what exactly does the brain start seeing differently when time is running out? What actually changes isn't the task itself. What changes is how your brain sees the consequences. When the deadline is still 2 weeks away, the consequences feel far away. Too far. Your brain knows the task is important, but important doesn't always mean urgent. And for the brain, urgency almost always wins. The problem is, your brain doesn't care about things that feel far away, because the future feels abstract, not real, not urgent. That's why you can say, I'll start tomorrow. Then tomorrow turns into next week, and next week turns into later. It's not because you're deliberately lying to yourself. It's because the consequences don't feel real enough yet. Now compare that to a few hours before the deadline. Suddenly, the situation changes. Now the delay feels real. The risk feels real. The time feels real. And for the first time, your brain stops seeing the task as a future problem. Now it's a problem for today. But here's the problem. A lot of people know their deadline is getting close. A lot of people know they're running out of time. Yet they still struggle to take action. They still panic. They still get distracted. They still procrastinate. Meaning, realizing that time is running out isn't enough to explain everything. Because even though a deadline makes the consequences feel more real, it still doesn't explain one thing. Why is it that when a deadline gets closer, your brain can suddenly do something it couldn't do just a few days earlier? I'm curious. In your opinion, what's the hardest part? Doing the task itself? Or starting the task? Because those two things aren't always the same. Let me know your answer in the comments. What if we've been looking at deadlines the wrong way all along? What if deadlines never actually made you productive? Because what shows up when a deadline gets closer was there from the very beginning. Think about it. A few days before the deadline, you're still the same person. Then a few hours before the deadline, you're still the same person. Your ability hasn't changed. Your knowledge hasn't changed. Even the task itself hasn't changed. But the way you work can change dramatically. And this is where we start to see what's really happening. A deadline isn't the cause of productivity. A deadline is just a trigger. Because when time starts running out, the brain no longer sees as many options. Suddenly, priorities become clear. Suddenly, distractions feel less appealing. Suddenly, the task that had felt difficult all this time becomes the only thing that needs to get done. Not because you've gained a new ability, but because your brain has finally stopped negotiating. Before, there was always another option. I'll do it later. There's still time tomorrow. 1 more hour won't hurt. But when the deadline gets close, those options start to disappear. And when the options disappear, focus starts to emerge. That's why so many people feel like they work better under a deadline. But what's actually happening is that they stop splitting their attention across too many possibilities. And maybe this is the part we've been missing all along. The productive mode doesn't appear because of the deadline. That mode has always been there. The deadline just forces it out. And if that's true, it raises a much more interesting question. If that productive mode has been there from the very beginning, why can't we access it anytime we want? If you like videos like this, subscribe, because there are still many more mindset patterns we're going to break down. But if you pay attention, there's something very interesting here. If your brain can enter productive mode when a deadline gets closer, then that mode doesn't actually disappear. It doesn't come from outside. It's not given by the deadline. And it's not magically created in the final moments. That mode has been there from the very beginning. The problem is, that mode isn't active most of the time. And here's the important question. If that productive mode can appear without a new ability, without new energy, and without any change to the task itself, then what exactly needs to change? Because if the problem isn't ability, then we've been looking for solutions in the wrong place. What needs to change isn't how motivated you are, not how disciplined you are, and not even how hard you force yourself. What needs to change is how you activate that mode. And this is where most people start to misunderstand. If that mode has already been there from the beginning, how do you trigger it without waiting for a deadline? To answer that, you have to stop seeing this as a motivation problem. Because the truth is, your brain doesn't need motivation to start working. What your brain actually needs is a signal, something that moves you from not started yet to start now. The problem is, in normal life, that signal is almost never clear. You wake up today, you know there's a task, but there's never a single moment that truly says, start now. Everything feels flexible. Everything feels like it can be done later. And as long as that condition exists, your brain will always choose to delay the transition. It's not because you can't work, it's because there isn't a strong enough reason to switch modes. Now compare that to when a deadline gets close. Suddenly, that signal appears. Clear, direct, impossible to ignore. And that's when your brain immediately switches into work mode. So the core issue isn't your ability, it's the lack of a start signal. That's why the first step isn't about working harder. It's about creating a small trigger that gives your brain permission to start. A clear signal that says, now is not the time to put it off anymore. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. You wait for motivation, but what you need isn't motivation. It's a specific trigger to get started. If that trigger isn't there, your brain will always choose the safest option, putting it off. If we look a little deeper, the problem isn't just whether you start or not. It's that first second before you start. Because in that moment, your brain doesn't immediately get to work. It pauses for a moment and starts calculating. Do I start now or later? If I start now, is this going to be hard? If I put it off for a bit, what's the harm? And honestly, the easiest option is usually the one that wins, not the most important one. That's why you can have a clear intention, but still not move. Because your intention is never strong enough to get you through that first second. What determines the outcome isn't what you planned. It's how easy the first step feels. If the first step feels big, you'll resist it. If the first step feels small, you move immediately. And that's where the difference starts to show. People who seem productive aren't always more disciplined. They're just the ones who remove the friction earlier. You don't give your brain a reason to stop in that first second. You make the first step too small to reject. Not because you're stronger, but because in that moment, your brain doesn't even have time to argue. So if you look at all of this, the problem isn't that you can't get started. It's not that you lack motivation either. It's because you don't have two things at the right moment. A signal to start, and a first step that's easy enough to take. If those two things aren't there, your brain will always wait for a better time. And that usually turns into later. If you enjoy breaking down how the brain works like this, subscribe, because in the next video, we'll explore something even stranger, why you always wait for the right mood to start anything. See you in the next video.